Well, welcome to episode 53 of the Hunt Backcountry podcast, presented by Exo Mountain Gear. In this episode, we speak with adventurer, guide, author, speaker, Andrew Skurka. National Geographic and Outside Magazine have called him the Adventurer of the Year, and Backpacker Magazine have called him the Person of the Year. So not only does he have accolades, he has massive experience doing insane adventures. And in this episode, we get all kinds of information, as well as tips, tactics, and tricks, do-it-yourself gear, do-it-yourself recipes for backpacking. There's so much good stuff packed in here. And of course, we wrap up talking about elk hunting. So if you haven't heard of Andrew, you guys are in for a real treat. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Just want to take a quick second to encourage you guys to go check out Exo Mountain Gear at exomountaingear.com. We have a ton of new listeners recently, and if you aren't familiar with the podcast, you probably aren't familiar with Exo Mountain Gear, and we would love for you guys to see what we're up to, building great hunting packs. Also check us out on social media. Follow us at Hunt Backcountry on Instagram, or go ahead and check out the Exo Mountain Gear Facebook page as well. As always, guys, we will post show notes for these episodes, and you're definitely going to want to check out the show notes for this episode because we have some amazing resources to share from Andrew. So to get those show notes, it's real easy. Just go to exomountaingear.com/53 as in episode 53. All right, one last thing. Don't forget, if you're enjoying the show, leave us a review on iTunes or email us with any questions, comments, or podcast feedback to podcast@exomountaingear.com. All right, here's the show with Andrew Skurka. Enjoy. Well, Andrew, welcome to the show. How are you doing tonight?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Steve on the line as well. How you doing tonight, buddy?
Fantastic.
Awesome. Yeah. So, Andrew, some of our listeners might be familiar with you. I'm sure that many are not, and I will say that that is unfortunate. But you have done some great things in terms of outdoor adventure in general, and your specialty has kind of, been long-distance backpacking. Just to even say that, doesn't even do it justice, right? To say long-distance backpacking. I mean, just pulling some of the numbers on trips you've done. We're talking you have trips, your Alaska Yukon expedition was, nearly 5,000 miles in a 6-month trip, and this is all solo. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah, the Alaska Yukon expedition was 4,700 miles and took me a little less than 6 months.
Yeah. So that's insane.
That was in terms of gross number, miles, that was the shorter of the big ones, but those miles were much harder earned than the other trips.
Yeah. So talk about that. Yeah. The Alaska Yukon expedition, not only is it that country, but it was, you were doing a lot of the route finding and wayfinding yourself. It's not like you were just on an established trail for 4,700 miles. How much of it was on trail and how much of it was off trail, essentially?
Well, there are really no hiking trails like we would think about here in the lower 48. So out of the 4,700 miles, I think I figured out at the end that it was something like 2,100 miles of off-trail travel, either hiking or on skis, and then about 1,200 miles or 1,300 miles in some sort of usually a pack raft, and then for one stretch on the Yukon River, a kayak, and then the remaining miles, which this is now 6 years ago, so the numbers are starting to fade a little, or at least some of these little details starting to fade.
Yeah.
But it was the remaining quarter of the trip was on some sort of man-made something or other. So most of that was snow machine trails, okay. And then there were some ATV tracks and some and a little bit of road walking to link things up.
Yeah,
to kind of complete the loop. Yeah.
So doing rough math, it was basically 25-ish miles a day for 6 months straight.
Yeah, it ended up being about a marathon a day, but those numbers are kind of skewed when you look at it that way because, there was one day on the Yukon River where I had an 8-mile-an-hour current, and I could just kind of sit in my boat for 10 hours and cover 80 miles, and then there are other days, say, along the Lost Coast, down in the southeastern part of Alaska, where it was extensive bushwhacking through Devil's Club and Alder, and then I would have to blow up my pack raft to get across the glacial-fed river, and walk another mile and blow up the pack raft again. So much slower going there.
Yeah.
Wow. So how much of that were you able to, because I know you're a planner, and that's a bit what we'll talk about in a little bit later this episode, but being that so much of that route, there isn't established trails, how did you really piece that whole loop together? And then how did you sort of stay on course?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I went up there in 2009, and I kind of one of the intentions when I was up there was to scout out the possibility for doing something big up there. Because I had done some big trips down in the lower 48, but they were all on trails where I was basically linking up existing long distance trails. Like I did a trip in 2007 around the American West by linking together the Pacific Crest Trail with the Continental Divide Trail and the Pacific Northwest Trail. But that infrastructure was already kind of there. Whereas in Alaska, that infrastructure it's there in the sense that there are natural routes, but I kind of had to piece things together. So I started, when I was up there in 2009, I started scouting things out and started to kind of understand where the good travel is up there. So for example, what elevations, what slope aspects, how big does a watershed need to be for there to be enough water in it so you can pack raft. And then the one thing I didn't have any experience going into the trip was snow conditions. So that was a little bit of an unknown going into it, exactly like what interior snowpack in Alaska looks like. It turns out that it's really bad. Have you ever seen sort of like facets and powder so deep that like it doesn't matter how big your skis are that you just sink to the bottom?
Yeah.
That's what it's like.
Oh. Dude, that's brutal.
Yeah.
So I have a question based on these long trips. How do you balance being mission driven and like having this goal of covering so many miles per day with actually enjoying the process? And I want to relate that to hunting in the sense of, I think sometimes we get so caught up on maybe an extended hunting trip on things aren't growing right. Maybe the weather sucks and, the animals, aren't cooperating or we're not seeing them or whatever. And we are so mission driven that sometimes I think we forget to actually just enjoy the experience. I can only imagine a minuscule amount of that struggle that you face on a 6-month solo trip up in the Yukon. So can you kind of talk about that?
Yeah, I guess I don't really see the the experience or the mission part of it being any different than what I actually enjoy. So I think when a conventional backpacking trip, it's sort of designed around leisure. It's more of a getaway, and I enjoy that kind of backpacking on occasion, but it's not kind of my preferred style. So when I'm on a backpacking trip, I actually enjoy that the physical aspect of it. I enjoy the challenge, both mental and physical. So for me to put in long days, that's not that is something I inherently enjoy, and I think if the miles, I try not to get too caught up in miles, but it's very difficult because you always know that you have this this time clock on your back that's specifically carried in your food bag, and you know that you have 4.5 days to get out, and if you're rolling in at a little less than 5, that those last couple of hours are going to be pretty hungry.
Yeah.
So I try to let the miles just kind of roll as they do, and I find that especially with really engaging trips, so I'll define those as that are really challenging, with a lot of off-trail travel and difficult conditions, and that I don't I'm not preoccupied with the miles. I'm preoccupied with where to put my next step, or where to step next, and what the line of least resistance looks like from the pass that I'm standing on right now to the next pass. So
it's a really good point, just not to get ahead of yourself and focus on the moment.
Yeah, I try, but I'm it should not come as a surprise to anyone who takes a look at some of the stuff that I've done and said oh yeah, he's probably pretty focused.
That's one way to put it. Yeah.
And to relate it back to hunting, I mean, the thing that I have struggled with most is getting out there and as you said, the animals aren't cooperating. I'm not seeing them. I might be finding lots of tracks or scat, but I'm just they're not, don't seem to be anywhere around. I'm not hearing anything, and I got to be careful with myself. That's usually when the smart hunters, when they all go back to camp in the middle of the day and like go take a cat nap and go have like a good lunch, I'm the one who's like trying to the very low possibility of shooting one in the timber.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Yeah. So you mentioned food. I'm sure that our listeners who are unfamiliar with, someone embarking on a 6-month trip, how exactly are you doing food? Because clearly you're not carrying 6 months of food, right? So when you're doing a remote long-distance trip, what does that look like?
So, believe it or not, I mean, anyone who's been up and spent like a lot of time in Alaska, doesn't come as a surprise, but there are native villages all over Alaska, and for that matter, the Yukon. So, and each of these native villages has a post office, and they have regular mail delivery. So, what I was doing typically is I would have my packages sent via the postal service, and I'd pick them up when I got there. And you can send a package to yourself to any postal service via general delivery, and you just need to go up to the counter and show an ID, and they'll give you your whatever that you sent. So that's standard through hiking procedure. And then the way it worked on that particular trip is that I was able to resupply about twice a week for the first 2 months, about once a week for the second 2 months, and then once every other week for the last 2 months.
Wow.
So at some point you're carrying up to 14 days of food with you.
Yeah, those were pretty heavy hauls.
Yeah. Did you do any more natural, like catching fish or killing small game, or?
It's not efficient when you look at the time you'd have to spend trying to catch some fish, clean them, or catch a ground squirrel, and not to mention the mass associated with that. It's just better to carry a bunch of chocolate.
So what's your go-to food on something like that?
I don't really have a go-to because I find that over a trip like that, everything gets pretty boring.
Right.
The monotony is a little hard to take. Hunger is definitely the best seasoning, so my food tasted best when I was hungry. But I try to mix it up with tastes and textures, and so I'll mix it up with sweet and salty and crunchy and smooth, and throw some real food in there like salami and beef jerky and yeah.
So one thing on that topic that I wanted to ask you about, so many of us who are into sort of backpack hunting, backcountry hunting, would just essentially get stuck in the rut of freeze-dried food of something like a mountain house. But you actually do quite a bit on your own in terms of whether that's a dinner, entree, or even a breakfast or snack. Can you kind of give us an idea of some of the menu items or recipes that you've put together? I'm thinking I've seen your sort of protein cereal for breakfast, and then some of the dinner entrees that you pack yourself, so you're not reliant on freeze-dried food like Mountain House.
Right. Well, I guess everyone is wealthier than me because I struggle to spend $29 a pound on freeze-dried food. when you count it up and look at how much you're getting for how much it costs, it's very disproportional. So my food during the day is pretty simple. It's just basically I just snack all day. And then I sometimes too will take in some kind of dedicated lunch, like especially on shorter trips. I'll take in, say, a turkey sandwich, or I'll take in an avocado and throw it in with some Fritos or something like that. But then for breakfast and dinner, I have a little bit more of a legitimate meal. So my standard solo breakfast, if I'm like on a trip where I'm kind of getting after it, it's going to be usually like some kind of cereal, say like granola or grape nuts mixed in with protein powder. Really simple, really easy to do. It's fast. And then I have some other hot breakfast too. Like there's a cheesy potatoes that I put. So it's instant potatoes, cheese powder, crumbled bacon, green chilies. That works pretty well. And then another one is kind of some typical plays on say oatmeal or cream of wheat, where it's some mixture of nuts and berries and brown sugar and butter. And then for dinner, I've put a little bit more focus on dinner because I basically have a hot dinner every night. And my favorite meal is beans and rice with tacos and cheese. That's my go-to. And then I've got another really good peanut noodle recipe where I take out some ramen, and then I make up the peanut noodle sauce at home, or the peanut sauce at home, and it's actually good enough where we'll have it at home for like a dinner. And then so I'll bring that out, and then I'm trying to think of the others. There's a pesto noodle, so would be like again ramen noodles, but then olive oil, basil, some kind of nuts, whether it be pine nuts, or I might throw some walnuts in there if I don't have any on hand. And then another one is polenta and peppers, which is kind of an Italian themed meal. So, and all those, if your readers are interested, they could go there. All those recipes are up on my website. Kind of lays out all the ingredients and cooking instructions. And I should add too, as far as cooking, I mean, these are all really easy. Like boil some water, throw in the starch, and then once the starch is cooked, throw in the oil and the seasonings, and you're good to go.
Yeah. It's impressive. It's always good to see ideas, and I think so many of us are stuck in a rut, and so that's something I've done is just reference your site and let's see what's possible. Even if you don't follow the recipe to a T, it'll spark something for sure.
It'll spark something, right? The other thing I'd add, not necessarily related to recipes, is that when it comes to food prep, the one thing that I find to be really useful is to, at the beginning of the year, and for me, that's going to start saying like May-ish, sit down for like a couple of hours and like kind of figure out about how much food you need, go shopping, prepare all of it for like the whole summer, and then, or in your case, be like more the fall, and then that way you don't have to, like, before every trip, bust out all the bowls and the measuring cups and the scale and the bags and then clean up afterwards. Just do it all once and have it ready to go. And you can get out the door a lot faster that way.
Yeah. So when you're putting this together, are you shooting for any specific like calorie per day range or calorie to ounce weight ratio, anything like that? Like how specifically analytical are you getting to the overall big picture of your menu?
I don't even know what my numbers come out to, because I'm pretty anal, but I'm not so anal that after I've packed all my food, I would like pull it all back out and actually count nutrition labels. My general recommendation is 2,250 calories up to 2,750 calories, depending on gender, age, body type, and physical intensity of the trip. Mm-hmm. So, and I know that hunting is typically done in a colder time of year, and you listen to in theory, you should be burning more calories in the colder temperatures. But I find that the shorter days of these fall and winter months, those actually result in a net decrease in the amount of calories that I need every day. Hmm. Yeah. Because I can hike in the summer. I can hike for 15 hours a day, and I'll have daylight the whole time. I go hunting, and I'm not moving that much, and there's like 10 hours or 11 hours, maybe 12 hours of daylight.
Yeah, that's a good point. So let's talk about what you are using to heat this water to make these entrees. Mm-hmm. You have several sort of DIY stove systems that are alternatives to what many of our listeners, are used to, and probably use something like a jet boil. But you have varying degrees of DIY stoves. Tell us about the dirt bag setup. How much does that weigh? How much does it cost? And how can you put that to use?
Okay, so the dirt bag stove, it's an alcohol stove. You make it out of a 3-ounce cat food can, and you can get them at Walmart or Amazon. You get a 1-liter grease pot. It's like a pretty thin aluminum pot, and you make a windscreen out of aluminum foil, and go to Starbucks and get a $2 reusable plastic mug, and buy a $1 plastic spoon with a big shovel on it. And I think that whole kit costs about $22, and it weighs about 8 ounces. The issue so that system works really well for one person in milder conditions, but it's not super efficient, and it doesn't produce like lots of hot water quickly. So if you're like, I'm going to be heading out, so it looks like I'm going to be doing third season this year, so that starts the 1st of November. I'm probably going to want to have a bottle of hot water or hot tea with me at all times. And I'm not going to bring that stove, because I just want to be able to make water faster than that. So that's one system. The system that I usually, the sort of more engineered system that I like to use now in the summertime is it's the crux piece of it is it's a Sidewinder caldera cone, and it's sort of trying to think about how to explain it. It's basically a sort of a, imagine a volcano with the top of the volcano cut off, and then you put your pot right in that opening, and it's a really efficient system. It really keeps the wind out, and that system again weighs all in about 8 ounces for stove, pot, coffee mug, spoon, lighter, fuel bottle, the rest.
And that's also alcohol, you mentioned?
That's also an alcohol system, yes.
Okay. So with alcohol, say, let's just say theoretically you were just going to be boiling water for a dinner entree each night. So we're not late season where you need, the hot water throughout the day or what have you.
Right.
But just for one main meal per day, like kind of talk us through a burn time for that, and then B, how much alcohol someone would need to carry essentially per meal or per day in terms of volume.
Right. So the dirtbag system, that's the less expensive and less engineered one. You're looking at about somewhere about 3/4 of an ounce of fuel per day for about 2 cups of water, and that actually burns pretty quick. I'd say you're going to have boiling water in probably 5 or 6 minutes. The caldera system, that one is real fuel miser, and you're looking at about a half an ounce of fuel per meal, about 2 cups of water, and that one is slower. It's basically this trade-off between efficiency and boil times. So you're looking probably more like 10 minutes. And I know, if you're sitting around waiting for it, that is pretty annoying. But usually what I'll do is I'll get it going and then tend to something else. So I'll finish setting up my shelter, or I'll pull out my sleeping pad and blow it up, or I'll do a little bit of stretching, or I'll start looking at tomorrow's maps. And those extra few minutes in the scheme of things, pretty minimal.
Yeah, there's always kind of a camp chore, if you will, that you could be doing to multitask.
Right. So let's, just so your readers are aware. So the final stove system that I'm going to use, these are for the colder months, is a canister stove. So I usually just like the upright, like a simple upright stove, not even the integrated, just because it's a little bit more versatile, and I can mix and match pots with it, and it's a little bit lighter overall. But definitely canister is the way to go. You get hot water really quick. It's canister is way more user friendly than liquid gas or like the Coleman or the Whisper Light style stove.
Right. Yeah. Awesome. Well, once again, not to just keep on plugging it over and over, but all of those plans to build those stoves and the specs and really more information on those systems is on your site, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Awesome. So let's talk, we kind of covered food and then the stove a bit. Let's dive in a bit into gear while we're here. One approach that, I see you use and I think is very helpful is your gear list. And when I hear gear list, when I think of my gear list, a lot of times I'm just thinking of writing stuff down so I don't forget to put something in my pack. But you sort of take a broader approach and have a master list and track additional costs and calculations and conditions. Kind of talk us through the bigger picture of your gear list and why it's maybe more helpful than just a simple pack checklist.
Sure. So I have I used to run a lot of guided trips. I ran, over the course of 5 or 6 years, I ran over 55 guided trips with something like 400 clients. And I've kind of moved out of that. But one thing that I did as part of we had a pre-trip curriculum. And one of the things that I would do with each trip or each course is I would have them complete a gear list. And basically to make life easy on myself, I created a master sort of 3-season backpacking template that basically is applicable to every experience level, every gender, every location, and then spring, summer, fall. And I think that's the big difference between my gear list and a lot of the other lists that are out there, where those lists are, a lot of people's lists tend to be very specific to their conditions and their preferences and and where they like to go. And so someone else who picks that up, it might really lead you astray. It might suggest some items that aren't appropriate for your trip, or it might leave something out that either is really valuable or that you think you might really like. So, for example, like I rarely take one, but like there's a row item or a line item in my master gear list for like a sit pad, because when it's say like May and you're in say the Pacific Northwest or the Appalachians, like say like New Hampshire, and it's 45 degrees and raining on you, the last thing you want to do is sit down on the wet ground. So for an extra, say 2 ounces, you have a sit pad, and it's just sort of a reminder as you're going through this master gear list that you can take such things. So that's kind of where that master gear list came about, and I really tried to be as sort of as comprehensive as I could, without making the thing like really overwhelming. So like I broke it down by system. So for example, in there'd be like a place for shelter, and there are enough line items in there that accounts for sort of every different type of shelter system you might take. So if you're going to take a tarp and bivvy system, you can make it work in there. If you're going to take a hammock, you can make it work in there. If you're going to take a double wall tent, you can make it work with what I've given you. And I really encourage people not to add rows, because typically if you're adding rows to this gear list, you're probably going outside the bounds.
If the row's not there, you don't need it.
Probably. I mean, it's a pretty generous gear list. Like there's a lot of stuff in there that you should not take on a normal trip, and a lot of stuff that would be redundant with something else on the list. But I think it works. I think it's a great starting point for putting together a gear list.
Yeah, I guess maybe the only thing our audience can add is the hunting specific items, right? They can have game bags on the list.
No, I don't think my readers.
Little different audience.
Can I swear on this podcast?
Oh, sure. Okay,
so I was, I posted a comment the other day. So I have my cat. I have a cat that I adore, and I adopted him when I married my wife, and he sleeps in my desk drawer most work days. And I snuck out last week for a quick overnight, and he sort of took his position in my desk drawer first, like after my wife left for work, like all right, ready, all right, sit down in the chair and start working. And I'm like, no, dude, I'm out of here. So I took a photo of the cat and posted it on Facebook, and made the comment that I was heading out for my last overnight of the season, probably, or at least the last non-hunting overnight of the season. And some guy, he said something like, Andrew, I appreciate your insight on backpacking, but you're a fucking buffoon for going hunting, and it's just I find it just so hard to believe that you need to go out there and kill animals. I'm just like all right, bye.
Okay.
Yeah, all right. Talk to you later.
So yes, the hunt. So putting a sort of like a kill kit on my season backpacking gear list, probably.
Get some hate email.
Yeah. All right, we're that's like a topic that I want to get to, so we'll definitely get to that. But let's hang out on gear for just a little bit more. What do you like? What are the big ways that you see beginners to backpacking kind of go wrong?
They pack their fears.
Oh, okay. That's a good way to put it.
I don't know if I'm going to need this, so I'll take it. And just in case, I'll take it. And I don't know what it's going to be like out there. So, and when I went camping as a Boy Scout, I froze at night, so I'm going to bring a super warm sleeping bag, and I don't want to starve, so I'm going to bring a lot of food. Those are the classic things. It's a combination of naivete and just sort of being very too over prepared.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So how does one overcome that and actually know what they really do and don't need then?
Great question. Yeah, so that's kind of the next step. So one way you can do that is just by getting out and getting some firsthand experience. And
Starting with a smaller trip or something.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, do a shakeout trip. Yeah, rather don't like. So my first backpacking trip was. Actually, my second backpacking trip was the Appalachian Trail.
Like the whole thing?
That's not the way to do it. And I had no like I didn't come from a backpacking family. I didn't have any friends who backpacked, so I was like learning everything as I went. And there was not a single piece of gear that I finished with that I had started with. Not a single piece of gear.
Wow.
So, and as I got further north on the trail, I would say like, well, I'm not using this. I'm just going to get rid of it. And then I would also say, well, I could save like 3 pounds by trading this shelter for that one. And so that's the kind of thing that I was doing as I went along. So firsthand experience is really valuable, and then I think anytime you can sort of tap the know-how of a credible person, then that's a huge plus. Unfortunately, we're kind of in this world where anyone can be an expert. So you're
all you gotta do is call yourself one and have a website, right?
Exactly. Well, that's the thing, which I think is great because that's led to like the distribution of a lot of information that never would be out there. But it creates a problem for someone getting started because the signal to noise ratio is really bad.
Yeah, for sure. So you don't generally, to skip around to another gear topic here, you don't generally recommend a waterproof footwear or something with a Gore-Tex type lining, except in certain conditions. Talk us through that, because so many people just jump to, oh, it's waterproof and you need waterproof, that'd be great. But why is that always not a good idea?
If it were really waterproof, it would be great.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the way to start. So I strongly advise against waterproof breathable footwear during 3-season conditions. I think in extended wet conditions, it's inevitable that your feet are going to get wet, and you're better off learning how to deal with wet feet than trying to keep your feet dry. So, for example, if you expect your feet to get wet, say from you're walking down the trail and there's brush sort of crisscrossing the trail, and the rainwater is dripping down into your shoes, and your feet get wet. Or say you're hiking in July in Colorado, and you're dealing with a lot of high water crossings and snowfields at the higher elevations. Your feet are going to get wet. So if I expect my feet are going to get wet, I bring, say, a pair of sleeping socks at night, so I can be guaranteed 8 hours of warm and dry feet. If I'm expecting to spend a long time in camp, I actually will bring a pair of camp shoes. Usually just a pair of airline slippers, or even better, the flip flops that don't have the toe thingy, that are more like the arch. So those work great. At every rest stop, or any extended rest stop, I take off my shoes and socks and let my feet dry out a little bit. And then there's a balm that I put on them called Bonnie's Balm, and that reduces maceration, which is when your feet get all pruny after being wet for a long period of time, and then it also kind of keeps them moisturized so that they don't crack after they dry out. So those are like the techniques that I'll use to deal with wet feet, and I think that's a lot more effective than trying to keep my feet dry. Now, in the shoulder seasons and in the winter, I think that there's a much stronger case for waterproof footwear, because the reality is, it was snowing today in the Rockies, and I expect probably the high country to be shut down for normal 3-season it's like going for a trail run or doing an overnight backpacking trip. The high country is going to be shut down within the next couple of weeks, would be my guess. But at this time of the year where it's dry snow, waterproof footwear actually does pretty well, because you're not dealing with kind of all that liquid moisture, and then the waterproof liner definitely increases warmth as well.
Any tips for you're going to bed and your shoes are wet, for drying them out overnight?
No. That's really tough. So if they're wet, and especially if it's going to freeze overnight, but I just don't think, unless you have a fire going, I don't think that you can generate enough heat to dry them out. especially I mean, unless it's like a really lightweight pair of shoes that don't have much to them. You might be able to dry those out, but you're not going to dry out a pair of conventional hiking shoes or even for that matter a rugged pair of trail running shoes overnight. It's just not going to happen. So the one thing I will add, if you are expecting temperatures to freeze overnight, consider getting your shoes, say like inside your shelter, just to kind of keep them a little bit warm maybe, and then also always make sure to open up the tongue and the shoelaces. So it's one thing like it's bad enough putting your foot, which was really warm and dry, in your sleeping bag, and now you're putting it into a frozen shoe. That's bad enough. But when you're having to like cram it in there because there's there's like not a big enough
Frozen closed.
Yeah, it's frozen closed. That's a
another
real
issue.
Yeah, that's when you might just miss that morning elk hunt.
And I don't know where I saw this, but it was somebody just said lay your shoes on the side, which would increase air circulation through it or something. I've never tried it and didn't know if it would help or not.
Yeah, you can also take the insoles out to try to get a little airflow, or like if it is a relatively warm or dry night, you could like hang them up in a tree and try to get some airflow through them. That will all help. I mean, of course, the issue is that if your shoes got wet that day,
they're going to be wet the next day.
Probably, if it's been rainy, you're probably still going to get them wet, or if there's still a bunch of snow around. Just quick little anecdote. So in Alaska, your feet are constantly wet. My big Alaska trip was 38 days with dry feet, and then on the remaining 140 or so days, my feet were wet for all but like 2.
Jeez.
And there was one pair of shoes where I had, so in the middle of the Brooks Range, I had a barrel of food and supplies flown in, and the guy just dropped it on a gravel bar and give me the coordinates, and I picked it up, and I got this brand new pair of shoes, but it was on a gravel bar. So I literally put this pair of shoes on in the morning. They're brand new. I walk 20 feet from my camp and have to cross this river to get to the shore. So that was about how long. Those shoes were dry for 20 feet.
Speaking of that, was a question I thought of earlier. Is how many pairs of shoes did you go through and during that trip?
That wasn't that bad. I think I went through like 7.
Okay.
7.
Yeah.
And that's not that bad. So, what's the high on a trip, Andrew?
I think I went through 17 on my Great Western Loop trip.
Oh my gosh!
Holy crap!
Figure 500 miles a pair if you're lucky, and usually it's 500 miles if you can kind of milk them along. But if I have to make the decision between getting a new pair of shoes that have, or after say a pair of new shoe or a pair of shoes that have 400 miles on them, am I willing to go another 150 miles to my next resupply and put 550 miles on them? No, I'm just gonna have a new pair of shoes sent out at 400.
Yeah.
So, and that's one of the, thankfully a lot of, usually with these big trips, I've always worked with some shoe brands, so that's made that decision pretty easy.
Oh yeah. Have you found a certain brand or style, or are you going to wear the exact same shoe through the whole trip, or do you try mixing it up depending on does it change something for you as far as how it's rubbing and wearing?
Usually, I'm trying to think in the past. If I have a pair of shoes that's working for me, I'll just try to run with those the whole time. Like I was able to do that on my big Alaska trip. I think on that Great Western Loop trip, I had to change a few things in and out because the shoes that I started with just weren't quite cutting it.
Wow. So what's one more gear item? This is a huge question, but just I there's no right answer to this question, but I would love if you could kind of talk our listeners through how to think critically, maybe look at certain conditions and make some informed decisions. And that's on the topic of shelters. Yeah. It's just so overwhelming with the pros and cons and things like single wall versus double wall and going, full bathtub versus floorless. And you kind of just talk us through some of that and how to make a good decision, and say specifically for, the Rocky Mountain West in like September, October being the prime use case there.
Right. So let me,
Like I
I
said,
think,
big question.
yeah, it's a tough one. So I'm going to say like specifically for like say the traditional big game hunting season. Let's just look at the conditions that you're in. So bugs are gone. It's kind of like coldish rain or snow. You're spending a lot of time in your shelter because the days are getting shorter. And most hunters aren't carrying their tent all day long. They're usually going in, setting up a camp, and then working out of that. Or if they are if they are sort of a little bit more mobile, they're still not carrying it for 15 hours a day. They might actually be walking for say like 4 hours a day, and the rest of that time is spent glassing and whatnot. So I would personally, my favorite type of shelter for those conditions is it's going to be a floorless, full-sided tarp, or you could also phrase it as the fly of a double wall tent, depending on your point of view. A classic example of a full-sided tarp, floorless, would be say like the Mountain Laurel Designs Duo Mid, or the Mountain Laurel Designs Trail Star, or some of the Hyperlight Mountain Gear pyramids. And then just a couple months ago, Sear Designs and I released it's called the High Root Tent. It's a similar it's kind of a pyramid style, but it's got a little bit of a tweak on it. But same idea, where it's a full-sided, floorless, storm-worthy, and you want to get one that has lots of interior space, because the worst thing is being in a coffin when it's crappy out. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that would be my general pick for these conditions. Now, the one sort of qualifier I'll put on it is that I understand if some of your listeners just do not like the idea of essentially sleeping on the ground. So I'll at least put down an emergency blanket, which kind of gives me a little bit of a ground sheet, and it also provides some radiant heat barrier. But if your listeners are wanting sort of an enclosed living space, then at that point I would probably push them in the direction of either get a full-sided tarp that like I just explained, and bring along the insert or like the bug netting part of it, or just go with like a 2-person double wall tent and call it good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think I just had a deja vu moment, Andrew. I actually heard you speak doing a backpacking seminar quite a few years ago, and I think it was you that gave me the tip of like a polycro ground sheet. Is that what you used to use?
Yeah, polycryo. It's
polycryo. That's what it is.
It's window film.
Yeah.
Did you attend my presentation at Pack and Paddle?
No, this was at the Alpine Shop in St. Louis.
Okay, yeah, I remember that.
I don't remember if that was like with your first book release, but I mean,
it was 2012. I was on the road.
Okay.
I think, was that the one where my relatives showed up?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. That was Jean and Jean Sights. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. She was funny. So it's like my aunt's in-laws, and yeah, they've since passed, but both of them, she's like, yeah, we're just, so it's Jean and Jean, like one is Gean, the other is Gene, and their last name is Sights. And I'm sure she used the line before, and I'm like, hey, I introduced them to the crowd. I'm like, hey, everyone, this is Jean and Jean. They're a family. And she's like, yep, we're just an old pair of jeans. Because they were like, they're like 90 at the time.
Yeah.
So
that's too funny. All right, well, let's transition to getting a bit more hunting specific, and kind of dive into maybe some of the topics we talked about earlier with your audience and kind of your transition. So first of all, I would just love to hear what was the motivation or the purpose or really the reason that you got into big game hunting.
Well, let me say that my interest in big game hunting, I'd say I've just kind of been dabbling with it. It's not something that I've pursued aggressively. I still first and foremost consider myself a backpacker and an ultra runner, and hunting is kind of like I put in the same category as skiing, where it's an engaging activity for me in a particular season, but not something that I spend 9 months a year or 12 months a year thinking about. So my interest in big game hunting was, I'd say, like primarily it was I originally got into it for wanting to kind of close my food chain, not sort of becoming increasingly uncomfortable with where my meat was coming from. So that was one big motivation. Another one was just that I had identified it as an activity that would present me with a learning curve and something that I would benefit from. And then maybe kind of related to that was that it's a good reason to go backpacking in October and November because otherwise there are no good reasons.
Yeah. For sure. So you mentioned the learning curve. In what ways did your previous outdoors experience help shorten that learning curve, do you think? And at the same time, what were some of like the big challenges or lessons that you've had to learn and are still learning?
Well, the one thing that I really had going for me when I started big game hunting was that I knew how to backpack and to be outdoors. Like I had mastered that. I was like really good, and I'm also like pretty because
you
I'm
literally like
pretty
wrote the book on it, right?
yeah, really, yeah. So, and the other thing is that because I'm pretty analytical, it was I would say I was able to like navigate the hunting gear aspect probably more easily than most beginners. That all said, I didn't know jack about hunting. So, like I have no family members who hunt. I have no neighbors who hunt. I live in Boulder, Colorado, one of the most liberal places in the country, and there are probably diets of every variety, including many vegan and vegetarian themed. So this is like not a good place to learn how to hunt. And I think to learn how to hunt, it really is a matter of firsthand experience. I mean, you can read about it, but it's just not the same as being out in the fields. Like I picked up a couple of books and I met with some guys who were willing to take me under their wings a little bit, but the last year I was finally successful, and I attribute a lot of that just due to the fact that I'd spent 2 seasons prior searching the Colorado woods for elk that weren't there. So I had some more practical experience going in. The one thing I will say you can learn beforehand, which is almost scary, but you can learn how to butcher an elk online. Just it's I mean, the biggest thing I had butchered prior to my elk last year was a rotisserie chicken, and getting that thing down on the ground, just starting to cut quarters off. I mean, it was like, but it was very it was very intuitive, and I'd watched a couple of good videos that really helped me figure it out. So, did
you find that process? Like, not from a technical perspective, but like the feeling of like butchering a big game animal, did you find that like very awkward or somewhat? Like I heard actually someone describe it recently. They were, an adult who just started hunting, kind of like you had no experience, no exposure to hunting. And they basically said it wasn't until that point that they actually started to process this animal that it really felt like natural or like primal, some sort of connection in a way. How was that for you?
For me, it wasn't the first time that I felt that primal part. I mean, for like the first time I went hunting, I thought I was like just totally dialed into this hunting thing. It was like, like this is what I want to do since I was a kid. So like that idea of hunting and like just being like totally focused on an animal, I felt that the very first time I went out. But as far as processing the animal, it's pretty intuitive. I mean, if you have a basic understanding of anatomy, and if you've watched some of the materials online, it's pretty easy. I mean, there are a couple of little tricky cuts. So especially like if you're going to do the gutless method and like getting into the tenderloins, that can be a little bit tricky. And then the other tricky part I found was that at some point you've pulled so much meat off of it that you no longer like can look at it and go like, oh yeah, that's where the head was and that's where the leg was. It's just kind of this. You don't even know what you're looking at anymore. So kind of navigating this this carcass that doesn't have the landmarks on it anymore became a little bit difficult. But by that point, you've got almost everything off anyway, so it doesn't matter so much.
Yeah. So you've written about your your experience of becoming a hunter on your site and shared helpful information as you share with all of your activities, really. But you described your hunter education course specifically as a wasted opportunity to meaningfully educate a first-time hunter. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I was really disappointed with my hunting education or my hunter education course. I understand that it's a volunteer program. It's volunteer instructors. But if the Colorado Parks and Wildlife is going to insist that every hunter in the state spend 2 days, 2 weekend days learning or getting some degree of hunter education, then at least make it worthwhile. Let's not watch videos that were filmed in the 1970s. I knew nothing going into this, so it would have been useful, for example, to talk about the different calibers that you could use when you're hunting, or maybe some skills on actually hunting, like what animal, what wildlife travel patterns are like, and they just didn't really go into any of that detail on it. It definitely, that post made it to Colorado Parks and Wildlife, so because they followed up with me after the fact. So if your readers are really interested, they can go read it, and hopefully, CPW maybe took that to heart and try to do something. But I recognize also limitations of it being a government organization with volunteer instructors.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I didn't at all mean to imply that you were just bashing them. I just wanted to know, in what ways did you feel it didn't prepare you well? I think one thing that's interesting, too, is, I think it's the same way in Colorado as it is for me here at home, but the hunter education course, you could have, a 10-year-old or whatever the legal age is to hunt.
Yes. And
you could have, someone like yourself who's an adult, but it's their first time hunting. And so to create a curriculum that's valuable for both is, I think, difficult. And I think it would be really interesting as more and more adults are hunting for the first time to have something that's geared specifically towards them versus, a child, essentially, that's learning to hunt. And they're going to learn a lot of the hunting lessons from their father or grandfather or whoever's taking them hunting, but having a hunting specific course for adults who are just starting, I think, would be really helpful.
Yeah, that would be a great initiative, because that's exactly the way it was in our class, where there were 10 and 12-year-olds who were also taking the same test, but their father or their mother was right next to him the whole time, and it was I was kind of jealous of that 10-year-old, because I knew that his dad was going to teach him how to hunt, and meanwhile my buddy and I were going to run around the woods looking for elk, trying to figure out how to do it. So but yeah, they're definitely, it's not an easy task that they have, and I think that there could be value in the program. I'm not convinced that I saw that value.
Yeah. So a question that I wanted to ask that you already hinted at was, as a public figure, essentially, with your background in the outdoors crowd, with the Boulder-esque crowd, if you will, how were your ventures into hunting received by your audience and your followers? You obviously mentioned that some have been fairly hostile, but how have you sort of navigated that territory? And I guess in the end, you don't regret, publicly sharing this pursuit?
No, I don't regret publicly sharing at all. I think anytime that I can be an informational resource to readers is a good thing. So I would say that definitely some readers were hostile. I definitely incurred a record-setting number of page unfollows on Facebook. But at the same hand, it was almost a record number setting of likes. And I think that there's a lot of people out there who eat meat. In fact, the majority of people eat meat, and a lot of people recognize that that the industrial farming that produces this meat isn't really that healthy for the animal, isn't really that healthy for them. And I think that they appreciate someone going out there and doing it the old-fashioned way, and closing their food chain, and understanding firsthand the ethics of killing an animal to eat it. Mm-hmm. So I think that the overwhelming majority of people appreciated what I did and respected what I did. there are definitely a handful of people who didn't feel that way, and and that's okay. That's their choice. I think the one thing that I would sort of encourage people to do on both sides is to be sort of open-minded and about different points of view on this. Like my wife does not really like to eat that much meat. She really struggles to eat like meat when it's like very obviously meat. So like you will never see her sit down and eat a steak. But she but she doesn't also like hold it against me that I do like to eat meat. Whereas I think that there are some of the individuals that have been hostile. I mean, it's like like I spat on a Jesus figure or something. Like it's that much of a right. sin that I did, and I'm just not. Yeah.
So, what do you think we as hunters can do to help portray hunting in a positive light, and not win over people, but just help portray hunting in a positive light to those who are not completely hostile, who are a little bit more open-minded, or at least kind of on the fence about whether hunting is or isn't a good thing?
Well, I would in general say that when I am hunting, I do try to be a representative of the hunting community and be respectful of other users, and to sort of convey that I'm interested in a similar outdoor experience that they're in, just with a little bit of a different twist. I think before I got into hunting, whenever I saw hunters, I would usually pepper them with questions, which I tend to do to most people anyway. And I always appreciated a hunter taking some time to like explain different things about hunting to me. So like I remember I was during one of my trips, I was walking around Ohio during their hunting season, which if I remember right, like hunting season in Ohio, it sounds like I think it lasts like a week, and it's slug only, no rifles, and or I guess just, and then because it's only a week, and because there's so many people in Ohio, basically the whole state shuts down, and there are like hordes of hunters out in the woods. But the ones that I ran into, like it was really cool, like to watch them, say, butchering a deer, or like ask them, like, well, what do you do when you're sitting up in that tree stand for 6 hours? So I think that was good. But it's a difficult divide. I mean, it's one of those. It should be a good relationship that we have with like the REI crowd and the Cabela's crowd, or now should we say the Bass Pro crowd. But it kind of reminds me of like hikers or backpackers versus mountain bikers in regards to wilderness use, where like we should be on the same side of this. Like we're both interested in a backcountry or an outdoor experience. It's just a different way of experiencing it, and we should see things more eye to eye than we probably do. Yeah.
In the end, it's family infighting, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Yeah, it's family infighting. Yeah. I mean, the reality is, and I don't think there's definitely like a contingent of the REI crowd who thinks that hunters are awful and mean and murderers, and in reality, like hunters are largely responsible for the reason why we have herds of wildlife anyway. So but I don't think they that's not a convenient fact for them to hear.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't fit their agenda.
Yeah, don't throw facts and logic into the mix sometimes when it's an emotional argument, right?
Yeah, no, they're not designed to mix. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Andrew, so appreciate the time. Valuable information and entertaining conversation for sure. As we kind of mentioned, there are a ton of resources on your website, from gear lists to recipes to, I mean, like pretty much anything you can think of, you've gone into detail on. And I'm not joking, as you were talking about foot care earlier, I'm remembering seeing very detailed posts on not only how to care for your feet, but what to pack. So listeners, almost anything you can think of backpacking related, be sure to check out Andrew's website. Tell us what your website is, Andrew, as well as I know that you have, books and have done like an ebook on food and kind of the other resources that our listeners could go check out.
The primary resource is going to be my website, and that's my last name is spelled Skurka, Skurka, and so it's andrewskurka.com. If you Googled for me, you'd come up with me really quick. It's pretty distinct name. So that's kind of the key resource. If you want a single resource on backpacking gear mixed in with a little bit of skills, I have a book that's out. It's called Ultimate Hiker's Gear Guide. It was published by National Geographic. It came out in 2012. There'll be a new edition coming out in the spring, also published by National Geographic. And depending on the level of urgency, the first edition was really good. The second edition is I think it's phenomenal. So you might just consider holding off or maybe buying both. And then I'll throw out there, if any of your readers want to contact me about questions about backpacking, by all means, feel free. My contact info is up on the website, and I field probably at least daily a question or two from listeners, in addition to the comments on various blog posts. So I'm happy to be a resource.
Yeah. Do you have an email list or something if our listeners want to, I want to get that book in the spring but don't want to forget, that they could sign up for or anything?
I do. There's a little email capture box on the website.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. Well, Andrew, once again, appreciate all the time. Well, that's a wrap with this one. Big thanks to Andrew for taking the time to share this information with us. Don't forget those resources that we've mentioned throughout this show, as well as how to build the stove and some of those backpacking recipes, those types of things. Go ahead and check out the show notes for this episode at exomountaingear.com/53. And once again, we would love to see a review on iTunes if you're enjoying the show, or you can email us to podcast@exomountaingear.com with any other questions or feedback. Until next time, guys, we appreciate it. Happy hunting. Get outdoors.